Hello, everyone. My name is Tara, and this is a workshop on, I guess, understanding what the design job application process is like. And I'm just going to give a few minutes for a couple people to roll in. I know I personally was never the most punctual, so yeah. Um, okay, so I'm going to start because there is quite a bit of information in this workshop today. So welcome to Supercharging Your Design Career. And today we're going to demystify and prepare you for the job application process. So my name is Tara. I am a product designer during the day and a virtual reality researcher during the weekend, really. I was the founding designer at a pre-seed stage startup that was seed stage by the time I left. And I'm currently designing at Lupio, which is, it's more like a B2B type software company in Toronto. So I do have a bit of experience working in very, very small startups, understanding the design culture there, and also in mid-sized organizations. And I actually just switched my job. I went to Lupio not too long ago. I want to say I started in early August. So the job hunting application process is really fresh in my mind. And I was like, even though I felt like I knew what I was doing, I did a bunch of internships. I did a master's degree in design and everything. I realized I didn't really know a lot of things that were happening in industry. So I just wanted to put together almost like a little crash course to guide you through a couple things that might not have been so obvious. So this presentation is not for everyone, but everyone is very welcome to stay. So this talk is really geared towards people who are looking to pivot into design as a career, who are looking to, understand what the field is like for a first full-time design gig. Maybe you're just curious about the design hiring process. Maybe you are a student who's getting ready to graduate. And in that case, you just want to know a little bit how you just want to know a little bit about how full-time design hiring differs from internship hiring. Just a big note that this talk will not really be about internship hiring. There are a few similarities, but in my experience, understandably, full-time hiring is a little bit more comprehensive and there are a few more steps required. And also, I don't really go in depth into how to build a strong application in terms of a portfolio, resume, case studies, etc. Those are really both an art and a science in themselves. And this presentation would never end if I actually went into those. But I do add a couple sources into the workshop backpack, and these are ones that I personally have used and really liked as well. So a couple topics that we will be going over today. The first one is really understanding what goes on behind the company, or like what goes on behind what you think happens at a company when they start putting out applications. I also talk about different types of designers. So just because you see a design posting, it doesn't necessarily mean that that posting is right for you. And there are graphic designers, visual designers, service designers, and just to break down a little bit of what each one is about. We also look very high level at a job posting and what is really important to highlight in your application. We talk about the different types of interviews. So your full-time design hiring process will have on average around 4 to 5 stages, and we'll talk about what each one of those is like. I also kind of highlight tracks and levels. So this is really important for, if you want to understand, are you junior, are you senior, how can you level up? What does this look like for your career trajectory in the future? Number 6, types of companies. So we do look at 4 major types of companies. So like startups, agencies, etc. The differences between design cultures and practices between all of them. And there's no wrong answer in terms of what you prefer or not. And the last one is really just a couple tools, a couple tricks that maybe even a couple questions that you can start asking yourself to prepare you for, the job application or job hunting process. So the first topic, behind the scenes. So this is really the company's side of the hiring process. So what exactly happens at a company? So they do have to put in quite a bit of efforts in terms of attracting, interviewing, and hiring talents. It's not really as simple as throwing something online and getting like 5,000 applications and being able to choose one. Even before they do any of that, before they throw up their applications, they have to internally discuss the role and expectations for who they're going to hire. So especially if a company already has a design team, even if it's large or small or something like that, even just another designer, they know what gaps they're trying to fit, what gaps they're trying to fill with this new hire. So they do need to communicate that to the hiring team. They need to communicate that to HR, talent acquisition, and they also need to make sure that the job posting that they put online is very accurate. So I guess one trap is it's very easy to accidentally oversell the position. Sometimes you think like, oh, I really want this like ideal designer. But in reality, if you're looking for a more junior designer, you have to accurately reflect that in your job description as well. On top of that, I mentioned talent acquisition, HR, etc. So on top of those people, your hiring manager, so maybe someone from the product team, your design director, etc., and also your panel of interviewers. So your senior designers, your researchers, etc., they have to fit in all these stages of all these interviews for you and for every other candidates into their calendars. And this takes up a lot of time from doing work that, provides quite a bit of value to the company. And the very last thing is they have to evaluate you at every single step. So your portfolio, your interview impressions, your challenges, your thought process, they not only have to evaluate you as a single person, but they also have to evaluate you against every single person that, you're facing. So you're being compared every single step of the way. And I know, sorry, that sounds really scary, but unfortunately, that's the truth. So I have a question for everyone. How long do you think the design hiring process typically takes? And just drop it in the chat if you're on YouTube, Slido, etc. Just really curious what people think. Okay, I see Kyle is saying 6 months. That's a little long, but I think that might actually be possible. Mohammed is saying 1 month. Yeah, give or take. That's a number that I think is a bit more common. Maybe 3 months. I've definitely seen that before as well. Larger companies do tend to have longer hiring processes because they have more stages. That's just kind of the way the game is played. But okay. So in my personal experience, I've seen that it takes around 20 days to a couple months. And this is really, oh, someone is also saying it depends on the company maturity level. Yes. So for an example, if you are at Google, you are going to, Google, last time I heard, goes up to 7 rounds. So that's not going to happen in 20 days. That honestly looks closer to like 2 or 3 months. But 20 days is really, I would say like on the short end. And I do want to highlight that if a company is really desperate to hire you, that might not really be the best sign either. So definitely think about 20 days to a couple months, really more like 1 month to a couple months. And yeah, this is just for when you start talking with the company though. Your actual job hunting cycle should have many of these overlaps. So different types of designers, just a really brief walkthrough of each role. So I'm going to make a wild assumption, and I could be very wrong here. But UI, UX product and interaction designers, these are some of the most popular designers on the market these days. And I'm going to assume that if you're here at a hackathon, maybe this is the one that you could be the most interested in. But that being said, hopefully this program, Figma, is not too unfamiliar to you. And really here, if you are the type of designer, you design a lot of screens, you design a lot of flows, a lot of digital products, really. And if you're a product designer, you fuse business and product requirements with a lot of your work. So it's not really just about how can we make sure this user clicks on this button. It's really about how do we make sure all of these goals that we're really working towards, they contribute to our company objectives. How do they contribute to our product roadmap? So you do have that more elevated thinking. And these types of designers also have a lot of ownership in the design thinking process. So this also includes a lot of background research, a lot of needs gathering, execution, ideation, and sometimes even working really closely with developers to make sure that you're able to hand things off. So the next type of designer is also quite popular these days, web designers. I've seen a lot of these in agencies, but currently the company I work at, Lupio, also has a web designer, and I, as a product designer, don't really work with the web designer. They work primarily on marketing material. And these designers, they can either just create the visuals for a website, or they can even immerse themselves in website builders like Webflow or WordPress. So motion designers, these ones create a lot of artwork, a lot of fancy graphics, a lot of, I don't want to say flashy graphics because they're absolutely amazing. A lot of motion graphics, for lack of a better term. For all sorts of media, they bring a lot of graphics to life, a lot of visual effects. So these ones, you would probably have a lot of rendering software, a lot of Adobe After Effects. So traditional graphic and visual designers. These ones are, your traditional designers. They do have a strong background in design theory, typography, color, etc. I actually forgot to mention my lovely workshop helper today, Helen, did study graphic design at OCAD. So if you have any questions for graphic design, we can probably ask her after. So your service designers, business designers, these are really your design consultants. So this is kind of like UX and product thinking blown out of just a digital space. So you're designing end-to-end services. You do a lot of workshop facilitation, you do a lot of research, and your final output is not really a digital screen. So just for some background context, I did spend some time doing some service design work, and my particular project was on youth homelessness. Our final prototype at the end of the project, my team and I, we made a series of brochures. We proposed a bunch of process changes. So this is how dissimilar this is to digital design. Your brand and communication designers are very, very focused on crafting brands, really telling the story, selling the brand of their clients. So this includes a lot of logo design, a lot of branding packages, pitch decks for clients to, win more money, win more sales. I grouped content designers and UX writers together, but in reality, they're not exactly the same. But the thing that holds them together is that they focus a lot on information. So I spoke to a content designer from Shopify, and he was telling me that the content design team, they have a lot of librarians because they really need to understand how to store information, how to make sure it's accessible again. And UX writers, they focus a lot on the mood, the tone, the language, etc. And this is typically more towards users. They could be internal users or external users. At the end of the day, these two designers really focus on how information is stored and conveyed. Design strategists are a bit less common. They are a bit more in the management level sort of group. And these are high-level thinkers that define approaches for problems, how to plan, how to execute, how to handle stakeholders. And these, I guess if I had to describe them in one word, I would say they're like project managers, but designers. And the last one is really design researcher. So technically not a designer, but they work very, very closely with product designers, service designers, etc. And a lot of their insights are funneled back into solving a bunch of problems or, just crafting the solution that these designers are coming up with. So they typically do belong on the design team, but not really labeled a designer. And I do have a question for everyone. What type of designer would you consider yourself? So I'm really curious to understand what you consider yourself today, and also what type of skills you want to build or grow in. Oh, okay. So someone said they're in product design but interested in research. I have great news. They do go hand in hand. So hopefully wherever you go, they do give you a lot of research opportunities. So in my current role, I am, strictly more in product design, but I buddy up with my researcher all the time. And if I have any questions for any upcoming features, then I always know to go ask her, and she really guides me, helps me with my interview guides. So really great to see that. Kyle is saying motion graphics to computer software design. Oh, that's actually really cool. Computer software design, I missed that in my presentation, but definitely very cool to see that. I'm also kind of jealous. I don't have any skills in motion graphics, so definitely that's something that I would love to learn. Service design, very, very cool. There is a really big service design consultancy. Okay, it's not like too big, but I think it's one of the bigger ones in Toronto called Bridgeable, and that's where I went. I thought it was really cool. It was a really good project. So really encourage you to check out their summer internship positions. I believe they call them designerships, and you can get a good taste of it there. Julia says, new to design, hoping to be UX UI. Everyone has to learn from somewhere. So I'm really glad you're starting now. Really hope that you, learn a lot. I don't want to say fail a lot in a very condescending way, but I've fallen many, many times in my career. And I feel like that really taught me how to think things through a bit better. So I really hope that you do have a lot of great learning opportunities too. Architecture, interested in product service design. That's really cool. I almost went into architecture. But yeah, no, I do think it's like a really great way to stretch all those things. I hear so much about architecture, and I even read a lot of papers on architectural principles for like human-centered design. So I think it's a really great way to apply your thinking. Mohammed says software developer learning more about UX UI design, currently learning about typography principles, really great. Typography is honestly such an art. Yeah, no, really, really wish you the best. And I'm just gonna continue with describing what design is. So what exactly is design? And I highlighted so many different types of designers, but what are there any qualities that really draw them together? And I would say yes. So the number one, I say all of these are important. They are all very important. I don't think I would say one is more important than the other though. So intuition and empathy, do you really know what your users are feeling, what they struggle with, what they want? And are you also able to back up a lot of your, your assumptions or your thoughts with some data and insights? Like, are you completely off base with your audience? Hopefully not. Are you thoughtful? So how focused are you on the small details that actually do make, the entire experience? And do you aim to provide a little bit of delight for your users as well? So storytelling and communication, this is something that I think is often really overlooked in the design industry because a lot of people focus on you executing your craft. But in reality, everything that you execute has to be tied to a certain narrative or tied to a story. Like if you're solving a problem and you're just detaching that problem from the like your deliverable means nothing because there's no story to go with it. Transformation. So design honestly is very much about transformation in the sense that you have all these requirements, you have all these limitations, and you have to translate it into either a beautiful, polished final thing or a solution. So very much about getting all your research, all your insights, and translating them into something great. And that leads into the next one. So research. Are you asking the right questions? Are you asking enough questions? Are you talking to enough people? Are you using all of your insights to inform your design? So informed design, super important. And the last thing is your mastery of craft. So everything I listed up there is quite conceptual. It's a lot about process work. It's a lot about process thinking. But do you know how to execute your craft? Like, you can be the greatest service designer of all time, but if you don't know how to facilitate workshops, that kind of means nothing. Or you could be the greatest product designer of all time, but if you can't use Figma, if you don't know how to, express your thoughts and like create a tangible thing with it, then they're not really going to understand it. So right now, I'm just going to go very high level into what a design job posting kind of looks like and what are some important things. So company background, pretty self-explanatory. What the company does, what their values are. The description of the role and responsibilities, they kind of get a little messy because it seems a little redundant, but they do talk about different things. So description is what is the purpose of your role and what will you produce? Like, what does long-term success look like? Responsibilities are more like, what does success look like in your day-to-day role? What are some short-term wins that you can achieve? And lastly, requirements. So this is what I feel is the most important in a job posting. If you can't read anything, you can only read one thing. This is definitely the checklist you need to hit in order for a company to see you as a potential candidate. So here for this Dropbox job posting, I just pulled this off LinkedIn. The requirements are super, super important. So it's really crucial for you to highlight these in your application or in your portfolio. So it can't be as simple as saying like, oh, I love complexity and just slotting that into your cover letter. But it has to really be expressed in everything you do, like the way you break down your case studies, etc. It's really important to remember that at the end of the day, there are X number of candidates and your interviewer or your HR person or whatever, they are not going to spend more than like 5 minutes. 5 minutes is generous. I've heard differences from like 20 seconds to maybe 10 minutes for a portfolio. But they're not going to spend that much time on your application. And the easier it is for them to imagine you in this role, the better chances you have in getting an interview. And some key things I want to highlight include consistency, your toolkit, your ability to reflect, and if you have any considerations for impact. So consistency is really about making sure that if you do have a thought process, that you show it in not just one case study. If you have 5 case studies and 3 of them aren't so good, 2 of them are pretty okay, they're still going to see you as someone who's not that consistent in the way that they think and solve things. Your toolkits, similar to earlier, you need to show that you know how to use the tools that are expected of your position, I guess, of your specific discipline. And reflection and impact. So a lot of companies want designers who are very self-reflective on, you know, not just their role and their work, but also how they can grow. So a lot of things like next steps, what are some considerations we face in this project? What are some limitations that forced me to give certain things up? What are a bunch of iterations we went through and what were the takeaways? And impact in terms of, quantifying success. If this project went somewhere, uh, how would we have evaluated success? And reflection and impact are typically things that I think a lot of junior designers tend to miss. And that does affect their chances of being interviewed. So like I just delivered a bunch of theory. What does this kind of mean for you? And you will, on average, go through around 4 to 5 interview stages for full-time design hiring. And it's important to note that this is just a really general template for hiring. Every company does things a little differently. And for an example, number 1, recruiter call. Smaller companies won't have recruiter calls. But that being said, sometimes these elements are even shuffled in a different order, but these pieces are generally the same. So your first call, if you have a recruiter call, this is just a really general call to assess your fits, your interests, expectations, experience, etc. Your hiring manager call, which is typically around an hour on Zoom, or like Google Meets, they want to see your face, is really to gauge how you think as a designer, how you work within the team. And a lot of your questions here will be more about collaboration, more about design, a technical interview, but not too technical. They might ask a little bit about your portfolio, but you have a chance to actually go through it in depth in your portfolio review. So these are typically, your portfolio reviews are typically done with a panel of researchers, not just your design hiring manager. And this is where you get to, shine. You get to show your process, your projects, the things you're proud of, the way you reflect and the way you evaluate success in your work. And number 4 is really, really meaty. And to be honest, my least favorite part of design interviews. But there are 3 major ones. So your whiteboard challenges, these ones are actually my favorite out of all the challenges available because you don't have to prepare anything. You have to be ready to be there, show up, perform, think really quickly. And sometimes your interviewers they'll give you a prompt, you have to design or think of a solution and like talk a lot with them. Sometimes your interviewers will role play and that actually gets quite fun. So one of the challenges that I took part of, my interviewers pretended they were like teachers and parents, etc. A take-home challenge is not really my favorite because it takes a lot of time. So basically it's homework that you take home and you do, and there are really no limitations. They do ask you to time box it to maybe like 2 hours or something like that. But that being said, it's really up to you. It's just you taking time out of your own life. And you come back and you present it around a week after. I've also seen a heuristic analysis version of this as well. So they would just give you an assignment and you'd evaluate an app and you'd come back and talk to them. And that kind of leads into the last one, which is an app critique, which is also not one that I'm very fond of. But this one, you critique an app that you use a lot and you think about your user flows and you think about your pain points and you talk about it with your design hiring manager. And basically you talk about how things could be improved and what you assume would be limitations in the business model that, didn't allow for things to be better. And the last one is the behavioral interview. This is not going to be design oriented. This is actually with HR and senior leadership. And that's when they assess how you fit within the company as a person, not really about your skills, more so about how you communicate with people. How do you handle give or take feedback, etc. So design tracks and levels are also really important. And especially when you start, going for all of these interviews, it's really important to understand where you stand as a designer, like what are your skills, etc. And design tracks and levels, they really start to shine or they really start to appear when your company is not like itty bitty. The 10-person startup that I was at did not have any design tracks, but currently the company I'm at, Lupio, we have 200 people. So we did just finalize our design track system. But essentially, these tracks really help you benchmark your abilities as a designer. Are you too junior? Are you too senior? And they're just rubrics. Every company has a different rubric, but they do generally follow the same trend. So yeah, with each step upwards, you definitely expect an increase in pay and responsibilities. So right now I'm an intermediate, and the senior designer that I work with, she's on like 2 or 3 project teams, whereas I'm on 1.5, for example. And yeah, not all companies will have a set track system, but it is quite instinctive. You do understand where you fall in the hierarchy based off of the work that's assigned to you and who you get to shadow. Sorry if you can hear my stomach. It's been going crazy for the past while. But yeah, so this is an example rubric from Coursera and their individual contributor track system. So you can see, even though they break things down into 7 subsections on the side, there are still 4 major titles. And what does that actually mean? So your track 1 is generally your junior or your apprentice designer. And then your track 2 is intermediate. And then as you level up, you become a senior. I would say by the time you reach senior, a reasonable expectation would be around 3 to 5 years in the design industry. So please do not expect to, finish school and be a senior right away. There's a lot of stuff that I also had to learn the hard way to really count as experience. And then there typically are 2 separate tracks after. So your principal designer or your manager track. And your principal designer, these types of people, they really own like a certain part of the company. They're not really interested in managing people. They're really focused on perfecting the craft. And in no way are they below a manager at all. That's why I put them, the same column. It's just that a manager, they tend to focus a lot more on the growth of their team after a certain while. And then Coursera has a separate manager rubric. And this is very commonly seen at a lot of organizations with design teams as well. So the next section is really talking about different types of companies and which one, there's no wrong answer. Like I said earlier, everyone has different preferences, but also understanding which one is probably the right one for you. So the first one, startups. Everyone loves startups. They are a wonderful stomping ground to learn everything. So instead of touching a small % of the product and company culture, you get to contribute to almost everything, a little bit of everything. And there's no such thing as too many hats to wear. But depending on the size and makeup of your startup, you do run a little bit of risk into lack of structure, some disorganization, uncertainty in the company's direction. And unfortunately, a really big trade-off was having a poor work-life balance, poor compensation, and minimal support. So I do really want to highlight that if you are at a startup, it's really important to have a couple more senior players to really guide the direction or the growth of the company. That was something that I really struggled when I was at the startup, in the sense that there wasn't someone who was more senior than me that I could learn from. And that's really what I mean by minimal support. So if your startup is a little bit junior, then everyone will stay as a junior until they find someone senior. So your mid-sized companies, these ones are companies that are setting the stage for maturity. And these are really great if you want some foundation and some structure, but you also enjoy the flexibility and the intimacy of a smaller team. So these companies are often working towards maturity and finalizing their product market fits. And these companies, because they're a bit smaller, it's a lot easier for companies to push for employee initiatives, and they're typically quite well received. Generally, work-life benefits do look pretty good, but there is a risk for growing pains as the company is trying to strengthen their presence in the market. So there might be a couple things like internal reorganizations and just not being, I guess, like success or growth not being like that linear. It could be a little bit like up and down as well. So your large established giants like Google, Facebook, etc., these corporations are really established and they work like very well-oiled machines. So your role will be very, very specific. Like for an example, Google has an entire or like multiple teams dedicated to their search feature entirely. So you will be surrounded by a lot of people, but you might not be able to really own much. Benefits, pay, and work-life balance are generally really good. But like I said, your major trade-off is really the value and impact you provide to the company. There's probably going to be a lot of red tape as well in terms of making decisions, probably even being able to level up easily. But on the bright side, everything works. So if you really like structure and you really want to grow in this environment and like learn before you take it away to somewhere else, also really recommend large companies. So the last one that I really want to talk about, really agencies or consultancies. So these are really great if you really love novelty, if you really love working on new projects every single time. So your projects are probably going to be like 2 to 6 months. So every 6 months, you basically get to work in a different industry. That's really what it means. And unfortunately, there are a couple trade-offs. They're really driven by client interest. So sometimes you will have really, really tight deadlines and you will have to talk to your clients. If you do not like talking to stakeholders, this might not be the right company type for you. And unfortunately, your job security and work-life balance, they do heavily rely on sort of like inbound contracts. So might not be the most secure depending on how your company is doing. So this is another question for everyone. What type of company would you like to work at and why? Okay, so someone said they like flexibility, so they like startups. Kyle said they will be planning for entrepreneurship, so they'll be going down their own route. Really great. I really admire people who do have that startup drive and those startup ideas. I think it's something that I personally would never be able to spend all that time and effort and everything into, but I really commend people who really see that and really have problems that they want to solve. So really interesting. Really excited to see, or I expect the best for you. But okay. So, okay. Ooh, someone said agency. I like the ability to switch between different types of projects and or industry. Yes, I really, really wanted to work at an agency. I really think that it's fun. A lot of my master's degree was spent doing short-term contracts on the side as well. And so I kind of like made my own almost agency experience with school. I don't really recommend that. Yeah, I think personally speaking, context switching all the time, I didn't feel like I was able to do my best work, but definitely a really, really great experience. So the last section I wanted to talk about today was some tools to help prepare you for success. So it's really important for you to know yourself before you start applying for jobs. So really reflecting on your strengths, your weaknesses, what you value, etc. So questions that you can ask yourself include, how much experience do you really have? In that case, you would know it's realistic to not expect something too little or something too much. But there's always no harm in trying to shoot for more. I will put that as a caveat. Do you know where you want to be in 5 years? And that's completely all right if you don't. Everything is changing really quickly these days. Yeah. Is there someone you really, really admire career-wise? Is there someone who has taught you a lot and you want to be just like? Are there industries or companies that interest you more than others? What are your design strengths and weaknesses? So I will just say full disclosure, I don't really like doing workshop facilitation. Sometimes at work, when my fellow coworkers they ask me to facilitate like a sticky session or like an ideation session, I die a little inside. So everyone has their strengths and weaknesses. And the last question is really like a brutally honest question to ask yourself in terms of, have you actually put in the appropriate time and effort into refining your application materials? If there are things that you slap together, if there are things that you're not necessarily proud of, then you can't really realistically expect a really great turnout. So your job application checklist will consist of making sure that your resume is up to date, making sure that it's written well to highlight your impact. And I do want to highlight that, if possible, if you can highlight any sort of quantifiable output or impact, even better. Cover letter, if needed. I don't have any real advice for this, except it gets easier the more you write, although it is very time consuming and very tiring. Your portfolio. So is your portfolio updated? Is it user friendly? I have heard from a couple people that unfortunately, what's usually the most overthought about when it comes to portfolio stuff is the website that your portfolio is going to be on, or the format. If you want to do a PDF, if you want to do a Behance, that's totally okay. They focus more on that, but not really so much on their case studies. So this really moves to the next point in terms of making sure your case studies highlight your problem, your approach, your impact, rationale, trade-offs, and what you've learned. And your portfolio presentation. You will have to do a portfolio presentation. I believe I wrote it as stage 3 in the steps of a design interview process. It's best if you have this prepared ahead of time. The gold standard typically set of slides, and you can like slap in your company name on the title page whenever you go and present. Just have like a blank set of slides available. So yeah, are you prepared to present your work, or are you just rushing through it? Have you thought through your things? And the last one is completely optional, your job tracking sheets. This is something I just do myself, and it looks a little like this. I just like to keep track of the jobs I've applied to, if I have used any accounts. So like if I've applied through Workday, then I need to log in again. When did I apply? Like if I've applied like 2 months ago and I haven't heard back, then it's like, okay, hope is dashed, etc. But just things like this. And also because I update my resume as I apply. So I just like to know which resume I applied with. And never ever go to any interview without any questions prepared. So these are just some of my personal favorites. And just to keep in mind, you will need to ask different types of questions for your different interviews. Like you can't really expect a good answer from the HR person if you're asking a very, very design team specific question. But some questions I like to ask include, what is the design maturity of the company? Because this forces your interviewers to think about where the company is at. And if they don't give you a good answer, like, do you actually want to be there then? So what about my resume caught your attention? What is the potential for growth in this position? And this is a really great question because it shows that you are not going to like stay in your position. Like you really want to grow. You really want to show that you can do more. What is your compensation budget? Really fancy way of just saying, what are you going to pay me? I hate being asked that question, so I try to ask it first. What does the team structure look like? So if they say like 100 engineers to one designer, you might not want to work there. And why have previous candidates been passed up before me for this position? So I would say this is a bit of a tongue-in-cheek question, but sometimes it does catch people off guard enough to give you very honest answers. And then you can really evaluate yourself as a candidate against what they decided wasn't good enough. And the very last thing I wanted to bring up is actually a sort of Excel sheet, not by me, it's by Joel Khalifa, who was the design lead at GitHub. And it's really important to start, as you start applying to jobs, really remember what are the things that you really value. So like, do you value your work-life balance? Do you value your culture, your work culture? And what specifically do you value for your work culture? And this is really just a way for you to weigh your jobs. If you get like a couple offers, like congrats, which one do you want to take? So this is just a great way to, compare and objectively think through what this company or what this offer could mean for you. So I do link this in my hack pack. And yeah, this concludes the presentation. So if there are any questions, feel free to drop them into the chat, whichever platform you're on. What motivated you to stay in the startup environment? And do companies really look at cover letters? Every company is a little different. So that's not like a really good answer to the cover letter part of the question. I would say when I applied for the startup position, they did look at the cover letter. They didn't want just like a generic cover letter or a generic person applying, but I've also achieved a lot of success not really using cover letters in the past. I use it if I'm really desperate or if they really ask for it. Some things that I found successful instead of a cover letter, though, are to write a blog post about some of your things that you've done. So I actually wrote a blog post about what I did at my startup, and I used that to apply for Lupio, and they actually really like that. But yeah, to be honest, it really depends. I can't answer that. It's very different for every company. But as for what motivated me to stay in the startup environment, it was a really great learning opportunity. I wore like so many hats. Like I was the lead designer. I was an instructional designer because I was writing all these onboarding guides and all these help desk articles. I was also their help desk. I was doing a lot of outbound calls. I was best friends with the developers, and I actually learned quite a bit from them as well. I really think at the end of the day, the thing that pushed me to not stay was really realizing that I valued my work-life balance a bit more than dedicating my whole life to it. So I think that would probably be why I chose to leave. Also because the startup was in the medical space and I really, really loved working in healthcare for a while. I see a lot of people tweaking their resume to reflect a company's branding. Do you think that technique works? That's a good question. I would say when I worked as a service designer, I actually accidentally tweaked my resume to match the branding, and they really, really loved it. It was a complete accident because I had been using that as my personal brand for a couple years at that point. I would say if it's not overdone, then yes, it is very appreciated, but I also wouldn't prioritize you tweaking your resume or like rebranding yourself just to cater to this one company. If it's not off brand for you, go ahead. Um, but if you're trying to do it intentionally, then I wouldn't really recommend that. And companies will not look at you any less favorably if you don't follow their branding. What type of company do you feel is the most beneficial when starting your career and learning? Ooh, this is also a really hard question to answer depending on the type of person you are. So I did a lot of internships in a bit more like structured environments. And then I threw myself into a startup headfirst. And I think I learned a lot at a startup in the way I wouldn't have learned at a more structured environment. I learned, a lot of impact, a lot of freedom, and a lot of creating my own processes. But one of the reasons why I left the startup was because I didn't think that I was growing much as a designer. And I chose to go to a little more structured of a company to really teach me best design practices. Um, so I went from something that was kind of like a I don't want to say hot mess, that sounds a bit mean towards the company, but something that was really, really unstructured to something that was more structured. And I think the opposite approach as well is also perfectly fine. If you go to a big company and then you learn a lot of proper practices within those environments and within those walls, you take them anywhere you go. So it's really just a matter of when do you want to have that sort of structured learning environment. Also, if you learn best by doing, honestly, a startup is probably a really great place to do everything. When do you know it's a good time to move on from a company? That's a good question. That's also a very hard question because I felt a lot of guilt when I was leaving my previous company. But that being said, it's really a matter of, do you hate going to work every day? Do you think there are learning opportunities for you in this position anymore? So if you've kind of milked out every last learning opportunity, if you care a lot about promotions and you know you're not going to be promoted, or there are more people ahead of you that are going to be promoted first, that might be a good way for you to be like, hey, like maybe it's time for me to go to a company that will give me that promotion that I want. I will say it's never very easy. You do get a little attached to your coworkers, a little attached to your role. So it's really just a matter of trying to prioritize your career and your goals first. And I think these are all the questions for now. Okay, so I think I'm just going to wrap up the workshop if no one else has any questions. But I'm also on Discord, and I will be in one of the workshop lounges for the next while. So if anyone has any questions, then you know where to reach me.